The lecture you are about to hear sounds like Murray Rothbard, but it is not actually Rothbard speaking. Artificial intelligence was used to restore the actual lecture Rothbard gave in December 1979 at New York University. You can get the original recording from the Mises Institute. A link will be in the description. Rothbard's speech was cleaned of its many jokes and side remarks to make it flow like a written script while maintaining the essence of what he said. Finally, the editorialized speech was put back into Rothbard's mouth with the help of technology, so we can enjoy it in the metal of his own voice. The goal of this restoration was to make the lecture concise and accessible to those who find it hard to follow a noisy recording of Rothbard's slurred New York accent, including many Americans. As good as it is, this technology is not perfect. Errors can happen in the transcription and in the voicing of the text. Please refer to the original recording if there is any doubt. This audio is watermarked and should never be used as a historic document. Allow me to add a few words about the lecture itself. It is a tour de force. Rothbard demonstrates his deep understanding of history. He presents a powerful tool to understand it as a struggle between state power and liberty. He uses this lens to walk us through most of American history, from the colonial era to the end of the progressive era. He doesn't talk about the Civil War in this lecture, unfortunately, but he touches upon the ideology of the early Americans, the role of the Constitution and court intellectuals, the way monopolies were later formed by government regulation, and he concludes with the New Deal and how it turned America into a semi-socialist state. And now, enjoy Murray, not Rothbard.
Thank you very much. This is going to be a very bold talk. I'm going to try to roam over all of American history in about half an hour, presenting a new paradigm for interpreting it. Obviously, I cannot prove it in 45 minutes. Even in longer times, it has been difficult to prove. A lot of evidence has to be piled up as a way of looking at different aspects of American history. My basic view of history in general, not just American history, is the contest between liberty and power. Being interested in the question of liberty and power, I single this out as a problem. I am not saying there are not other important aspects of history. Certainly, these are the aspects that I focus on, and I think they are the most interesting and important. In this contest between liberty and power, which ranges over all of history, European, Asian, or whatever, I find it very fruitful to consider the distinction made by Albert J. Nock, a libertarian social theorist and historian of the 1920s and 30s. He distinguished between what he called social power and state power. He defines social power as simply the results of voluntary social interaction among people. In a market economy, that is the result of free exchanges and the capital, equipment, and prosperity it gives rise to. In non-market areas, it gives rise to civilization, art, science, friendship, and all sorts of cultural expressions, all of which are voluntary interactions between people, all of which he defines as society. Society being a label for an array of voluntary human interactions. Social power is what he calls a result of power over nature, power over civilization, culture, and economic prosperity. In contrast to that, there is state power, which is power over people, force, coercion, the attempted monopoly of violence in a territorial area. Albert J. Nock took the basic Weberian definition of government, or the state, as an institution trying to obtain a monopoly of violence in a given territorial area. He changed it slightly, but with some significant impact. He said the government, or the state, is that institution which tries to obtain a monopoly of crime in a territorial area, since its revenue is rooted in taxation and organized theft, and what it does is generally push people around in various ways. You do not have to be a libertarian to accept this framework. History, all of human history, is essentially a race between social power and state power. In other words, social power is the creative instrument. Social power is constantly creating prosperity, capital equipment, civilization, culture, and so forth. State power is parasitic and moves in to take charge of it, exploit it, control it, regulate it, and repress it. So we have these two forces, basically, in world history, social power and state power. The progressive periods in history are those where social power has spurted ahead of state power, such as the 18th and 19th centuries. The regressive periods in history are where the state is able to catch up with social power and cripple it, such as most of the 20th century. It happily turns out that in American history, this analysis of liberty versus power is not only important for almost every historian, but it in fact provides a key to most of American political development. Looking for three important paradigms in the last 20 years, I think any historian, not just a libertarian one, should use the very disparate names of Balin, Klettner, and Kolko to explain American history. All of them are very different, but all of them, it seems to me, add to this particular libertarian paradigm. By the way, in order to adopt a libertarian paradigm, you do not have to be a libertarian. You can either be in favor of power against liberty, or you can be indifferent to it. That is not the point. The point is that this paradigm stands by itself as a device to explain what is going on in American history. To start with colonial history, the liberty versus power concept becomes very important from the very beginning. In the first place, we have very disparate colonists coming over. Some of them come to achieve liberty in various ways. Others come for very different purposes. But since they come as just a few people on a large continent, there is a great deal of diversity and many areas where libertarianism takes hold even without a theory to expand it. For example, it is pretty clear to me that for about 100 years, the Maine coast, and for about 30 or 40 years, the North Carolina coast and Albemarle, was in an anarchist situation. In other words, there were a lot of people around with no government, at least as it appears. The North Carolina fishermen and farmers were basically fleeing from what they considered Virginia despotism. I am not sure if the Maine fishermen were fleeing or not, but they were there and did not have any governmental institutions. As I say, they have not been studied much, and I do not even know if they can be studied much. I do not know if they bothered leaving documents, which is one of the problems of social history. Not everybody, especially those without intellectuals or churches among them, bothers with documents. At any rate, it appears that they got along pretty well, were fairly prosperous, and had no government institutions. There did not seem to be any rampant anarchy among them. More specifically, we know more about Rhode Island. The Rhode Island colonies were specifically founded as refugees from Massachusetts Bay despotism, and we know a lot more about them. The attacks on Massachusetts Bay are no longer fashionable. After World War II, it became the prevailing trend with Perry Miller and others to say that the Puritan divines of Massachusetts Bay were really great people, largely because they were quite learned. They knew Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. I will admit they were quite learned, but I really do not care. It is a question of what your basic interests are. I still think they were tyrants and despots. I think they pioneered, certainly in America, a form of block tyranny path where you appoint a warden for each block to spy on your neighbors and report back to the church and things of that nature. So, you have different religious revolts and dissent from Massachusetts Bay and the ejection of these people from the colony, starting with Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. In the course of expressing their dissent, both in theory and practice, Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson arrived at very libertarian theories, and also established libertarian institutions when they got to Rhode Island. So we have at least quasi-anarchistic colonies in Rhode Island. Roger Williams was the most radical and the most libertarian in his early period, when he was also in touch with the Levelers, who were at that point winning the English Civil War. One thing we have to remember is that even though it took a long time to go back and forth across the ocean, people traveled quite a bit. Williams made several trips to England, and one trip, when the Levelers were almost at their dominant point, greatly influenced his libertarian direction. It is no accident that when Williams got more conservative and more statist later on, it was during the period when Cromwell had already taken over and wiped out the Levelers and installed his own particular despotism. So in theory and practice, Williams gets more and more statist, either for pragmatic reasons or just because he was giving up, and starts talking about the ship of state, having to have a helmsman and all that. He begins to violate his own religious principles. At any rate, he certainly applied religious libertarianism quite thoroughly until quite late in his life. He got pretty aggravated when the Quakers came in, because he thought they were going a little too far and being disrespectful of authority. But by that time, as I say, he was getting older and more conservative. Anne Hutchinson was the second major dissenter who was also kicked out of Massachusetts Bay. Both she and Williams, by the way, separately walked all the way from Massachusetts to Rhode Island in the middle of the winter, which to me is still something I cannot understand how they did. There were no roads, highways, or buses. and they walked to Rhode Island and set up their own colony. At any rate, Anne Hutchinson, in the course of also coming out with a religious position of religious liberty, became disillusioned with her own ally, William Coddington, the head of her colony, because he was getting too despotic. She then concluded that not only is it illegitimate for the magistrate to intervene in religion, magistrate being a general term for government, it is also illegitimate for the magistrate to do anything at all, to intervene with anybody in any area. In other words, it is fair to say she was the first American anarchist. After she left for New York and was killed in the midst of an Indian uprising, her tradition was carried on by her sister, Mrs. Catherine Scott. By the way, I do not understand why feminist historians have not resurrected these people. They were extremely heroic. Her sister, Mrs. Catherine Scott, and others, founded the First Baptist Church in America. They were all anarchists, known as the Baptist anarchists. Again, very little is known about their ideological views. It is one thing that has not been practical to study. Roger Williams's own brother, Robert Williams, became fairly anarchistic and engaged in a rebellion against Roger when Roger was beginning to abandon the libertarian doctrine. The rebellion, of course, was put down. But at any rate, there was a constant libertarian ferment, both in theory and practice. To me, the most charming example of anarchistic institutions in colonial America was in Pennsylvania. Edwin Bronner's God's Holy Experiment goes into some detail. Basically, for that period, Pennsylvania was quite populous, with about 10,000 or more people, and largely Quaker. William Penn, after having set up the institution, went back to England and expected to collect his quit rents, or his taxes, since he planned to own the whole territory and also be head of the colony. It turned out that he was not getting them. Bronner goes into the whole charming story about Penn at his desk, wondering, where are my taxes? Where are my quit rents? It turns out that Pennsylvania was more or less anarchistic. I'd say very close to anarchism. For about 30 years altogether, with a couple of periods of hiatus. There were no taxes being collected. William Lloyd was the keeper of the Great Seal, and part of the Pennsylvania Charter was that no legislative action could be taken without the Great Seal being stamped on the proceeding. He refused to use the stamp of the Great Seal, and this effectively brought the government of Pennsylvania to a halt. No taxes were collected. There were very few local taxes, and local justices only met for a couple of weeks a year. So, in effect, there was virtually no government for quite a while. Again, there was no report of rape, crime, looting, or anything of that sort. Everybody seemed to be quite peaceful and very happy in this situation. When Penn tried to restore the taxes and the government, he was not successful. He finally sent John Blackwell, a tough Puritan, which must have been a difficult thing for Penn to do, violating his own Quaker principles by appointing a Puritan to try to collect taxes and reimpose government. This is a charming story. One of the great stories of American history is when Blackwell arrives in New York from England and sends a message to Philadelphia that he is going to arrive as the new governor of Pennsylvania and that everybody should come out in the street to meet him with brass bands. He arrives, and there is nobody there, only a few small boys who throw pebbles at him. This is the great way that libertarians believe the state should always be treated. Blackwell gets increasingly incensed. He goes to the city hall and finds it locked, with cobwebs on the records of government that have not been used for many years. Nobody is paying taxes. He starts issuing orders, and nobody obeys them. He is totally frustrated and finally has to go home. One of the great anarchistic victories. Eventually, of course, the Crown reimposed control, but for about 20 or 30 years it was essentially an anarchistic situation, and everybody seemed to enjoy it a great deal. There were also an enormous number of tax rebellions going on all over the place in almost every colony. This is another very charming thing which has not been studied much. The paradigmatic case, for example in New Jersey, is some farmer, refuses to pay his local taxes. The sheriff goes out and confiscates his cow in lieu of payment. The farmer gets together with his brother, and they go and liberate the cow from the local pokey, using whatever necessary violence that entails. When the local government gets sore, they mobilize a posse to go out and arrest the guy. After they arrest him, his neighbors organize to free him. This was going on all the time. It is a magnificent tradition of local tax rebellion. After having a very anarchistic kind of heritage in the 17th century, which does not mean all colonies were that way, but enough of them were to make an imprint. We then had a much more uniform kind of political system in the colonies after the Whig settlement was imposed around 1700 to 1710. We then have a great new institution coming in, a very interesting new interplay of theory and institution. We have a remarkable situation where the Whig Party in England, essentially dominated by magnates, big landlords, and big monopoly merchants, is trying to impose mercantilism throughout the empire. At the head of the Whig Party is a brilliant politician, one of the most brilliant ever, Robert Walpole, with his assistant, the Duke of Newcastle. These were essentially laissez-faire people, completely opposed to mercantilism, in favor of minimal government, free trade, minimal taxes, and international peace. This was very difficult to maintain because one of their big programs was to crush the French menace and grab its empire. So Walpole is under constant pressure from the pro-war and mercantilist Whigs to impose mercantilist legislation and make war upon France. He is able, however, to keep them at bay by several mechanisms. He is able to run this whole thing, sitting on top of a volcano for about 20-30 years before he is finally kicked out. He is able to do it by running things with a system of corruption, through creating phony places, rotten boroughs, and contracts, the equivalent of a king's assistant pothole inspector for $10,000 a year, essentially doing nothing. By buying off a large chunk of parliament in that way, he is able to keep things running. Also, on the American front, he passes all this mercantilist legislation restricting American navigation, manufacturing, and trade, and he just does not enforce it. So the Whigs are happy because they passed the legislation, and the Americans are happy because it is not being enforced. So we have this mercantilist legislation, which was not being enforced. Then, as Balin has pointed out, in the internal situation in each colony, even though there was supposed to be a royal-appointed governor and an upper council, the elected assemblies were able to take power away from the governors, largely by the charming device of not paying the governor's salary unless he shapes up. The salaries were being paid by the colonial assemblies, who had to levy the internal taxes to do it. So this power of the purse, this threat not to pay salaries, gradually brought the governors to heel and made the assemblies dominant. By the middle of the 18th century, we had a de facto independent America. Not de jure, certainly, but de facto in large part. Americans enjoyed the situation enormously. In the meantime, as Balin has pointed out, Americans became increasingly influenced by a whole bunch of radical theorists. This, to me, is one of the most interesting things Balin has achieved, to show the actual mechanism by which American ideology was formed. In the old days, older historians thought that Americans all read John Locke, or were steeped in constitutional law. It did not sound right that everybody was sitting around reading John Locke. That just does not square with our knowledge of human nature. There seemed to be something missing. What Balin accomplished, it seems to me, is to put in the missing term. It is not that the masses read John Locke, but that a lot of radical writers read John Locke, and the masses read them. It was the intellectuals who radicalized John Locke and put his ideas in less abstract, more concrete, and more hopped-up language. Cato's Letters was the dominant one of these, along with a whole bunch of others. It seems to me that the radical opposition of 18th century England, the Commonwealth men who wrote Cato's Letters, were heavily read by Americans and reprinted all over the place in newspaper form and pamphlets. This tradition, not only of Locke, but also of Algernon Sidney, the Republican martyr executed by Charles II, was influential. Again, trying to interpret the American revolutionaries, it seems to me that libertarians are positioned to understand them better than other people, because many other historians get confused about them. Were they interested in political rights, personal freedom, constitutional rights, or economics and private property? Were they against taxes or in favor of liberty? Most historians imbibe whatever culture they grow up in, and most historians now cannot see that these things are all integrated in the thought of these 18th century revolutionaries. It is not integrated in the thought of the historians, most of whom choose either liberty or property or neither. But it was integrated in the thought of these American revolutionaries because they were marginally libertarian. To them, economic liberty, property, personal liberty, and an attack on imperialism were all integrated, all part of the same libertarian doctrine. Life, liberty, and property was not a vague term. It was a concrete ideology and set of actions on their part. To them, there was no difference between a tax rebellion and a rebellion for liberty against the crown and despotism. It was all part of the same framework. Taxes were a despotic act. They interfered not only with property, but with liberty at the same time. I want to read a little bit of Cato's letters because it shows the flavor of the stuff that Americans were imbibing throughout the 18th century. Cato's letters were written by John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon in the early 1720s. They were radical libertarians opposing Walpole's regime because they did not like the corruption, even though they agreed with Walpole's policies of laissez-faire and peace. They attacked from the so-called left, which in those days meant more libertarian. This is from Cato's letters. All men are born free. Liberty is a gift which they receive from God himself, nor can they alienate the same without their consent, although possibly they may forfeit it by crimes. The right of the magistrate arises only from the right of private men to defend themselves, to repel injuries, and to punish those who commit them. That right being conveyed by the society to the public representative, he can execute the same no further than the benefit and security of that society extends. When he exceeds his commission, his acts are as extrajudicial as are those of any private officer usurping an unlawful authority. That is, they are void, and every man is answerable for the wrong which he does. The power to do good can never become a warrant for doing evil. In other words, you apply to the government the same moral laws you apply to everybody else. This basically sums up the libertarian position. Cato then goes on to talk about the blessings of liberty, from which flow happiness, security, harmony, and prosperity. In this idyll of liberty, however, there is always the threat of encroachments of power from government. Here, there is a difference between Cato and the radical libertarians versus Locke. Locke talks abstractly, saying that whenever the government goes beyond the bounds of defending persons and property, it is legitimate to overthrow it. The Cato people said the same thing, and then they went on to say that government is always trying to encroach on liberty. This encroachment is always there. The inherent tendency of power is constantly encroaching on liberty and rights. Therefore, government should always be treated with enormous hostility and eternal vigilance, because it is always ready, sort of like a cancer. So it is a much more radical position than Locke's. To continue, only the checks put upon magistrates make nations free, and only the want of such checks makes them slaves. They are free where their magistrates are confined within certain bounds set them by the people, and they are slaves where the magistrates choose their own rules and follow their lusting humors, than which a more dreadful curse can befall no people. And therefore, most nations of the world are undone, and those nations only have bridled their governors and do not wear chains. We know by infinite examples and experience that men possessed of power, rather than part with it, will do anything, even the worst and the blackest, to keep it. And scarce ever any man upon earth went out of it as long as he could carry everything his own way in it. It is the nature of power to be ever encroaching and converting every extraordinary power, granted at particular times and upon particular occasions, into an ordinary power, to be used at all times and when there is no occasion, nor does it ever part willingly with any advantage. This is powerful stuff. Americans were imbibing it with great enthusiasm. So, the Americans imbibed this libertarian position, and they were de facto free. They had not only this libertarian position, but also a constant hatred and suspicion of government, or, as some might say, paranoia. The point is, it was a paranoia which was justified in most cases. Then, as other historians have pointed out, after Walpole was kicked out and the British conquer the French Empire, the 7 Years' War is over. The British turn around and say, "Where is our damn empire? Why aren't the Americans paying taxes? Why aren't they knuckling under?" The British then begin their grand design to reduce America to despotism step by step, to station an army here, impose taxes, and reimpose the mercantilist acts. They do it step by step, not wanting to alarm the Americans. But because the Americans were affected with so-called paranoia, in other words, because they had a healthy suspicion of the aims of state power, they immediately came to the conclusion that there was a plot at work, a grand design, and therefore they had to battle it and resist it to any extent necessary. The Stamp Act was a result of that. We now know that the paranoia was correct. Now that the archives are open, we know that British officials were writing to each other saying, "Okay, here's what we're going to do, A, B, C, in order to impose our will on America." At the time, of course, the Americans could not know this, as the archives were not open. So, they had to act on their best knowledge. America's acting on their best knowledge was guided by the fact that they were libertarians and had this deep suspicion of state power in general and the British in particular. So then we have the revolutionary movement. Again, to them, the attack on taxes and the attack on state monopolies were part of the same approach. The dumping of tea in Boston Harbor was an attack on both the government monopoly privilege of the British East India Company and on taxes. They were all one thing. If it was a libertarian revolution, what went wrong? Obviously, something went wrong somewhere, and it seems to me the seeds of what went wrong happened during the war itself. Here again, we have an enormous amount of new historical information brought about because of the success of guerrilla warfare in the last 15-20 years. People like Shai and Higginbotham have reassessed the military aspect of the American Revolution in a completely different light. It seems to me, in looking at the Revolutionary War, that there is a one-to-one correlation, almost without exception, between victory by American forces in battle and the use of guerrilla warfare tactics, and on the other hand, being smashed when not using guerrilla warfare. Charles Lee is a fascinating figure, the unsung hero of the American Revolution, who does not get monuments raised to him. He was a British radical and a military genius. He was hip-deep in radical criticism of George III before the war. He wandered around Europe fighting in different wars and came to a very important guerrilla kind of conclusion. As far as I can see, he was the founder of the concept of People's War, not Mao or Qi, but Charles Lee. He wrote several important pamphlets expounding his doctrines. When he found out about the revolutionary ferment around the Boston Tea Party, he immediately rushed to America to participate. He was, in a sense, the world's first professional revolutionary. The best generals in America were essentially Lee's disciples, Horatio Gates, a friend of Lee's from England who also immigrated here before the war, Nathaniel Greene, and Daniel Morgan. There were two basic ways to fight the war, which became politically and militarily important. One was guerrilla warfare, the natural method which won us the Battle of Lexington and Concord. This involved spontaneous uprisings of the American militia, the farmers, fighting a people's war on the spot, close to their homes. It expressed mobility, popping off officers from behind trees and rocks. This was not something you were supposed to do in those days. You were supposed to march out in an open field with your firepower, kneel down with muskets, and the officers would order fire. You were never supposed to shoot the officers. This kind of guerrilla warfare required very little in the way of taxation or inflation or government finance. You just go out there with your rifle, do your thing, and go home. The other concept of warfare was the orthodox 18th century warfare. You build an army, you have taxes, you get the guys in there for long enlistments, drill them, go out on the field, and handle the muskets in the usual traditional manner. This was the George Washington tactic. Washington hated the idea of being a bandit chief, as he called it. He wanted a real army out there, a real state apparatus running it. So you have these two conflicting ways of running an army. We lost all the orthodox battles and won all the guerrilla battles. This is the reason why Washington lost every battle he was engaged in, except for Trenton and Princeton, which was the only time he adopted guerrilla tactics, surprising the drunken Hessian troops on Christmas. The point is that Washington, as a total dodo, was interested in building up the state apparatus. So at the end of the war, we emerged with these two motifs. We emerged with a decentralized militia, but we also emerged with a national state army. We also emerged with a group of nationalists trying desperately to reimpose the British system without Britain. This became the Nationalist Program, which was later called the Federalist Program. We then launched a series of titanic political struggles between the so-called anti-federalists, who were essentially the libertarian heirs of the original revolutionary theory, and the centralists or nationalists who wanted to build up a strong state. They wanted a strong state in order to have a strong public debt, high taxes, a big army and navy, high tariffs to subsidize manufacturers, large public works, and a central bank to organize inflation and provide cheap credit for the political friends of the nationalists. It was a total mercantilist program, an English program without England. It is pretty clear these nationalists were a minority. They were able to put through the Constitution, which was essentially a nationalist coup d'etat, largely because they were able to get an alliance with the urban craftsmen, the self-employed urban artisans who had become inefficient during the war because they were sheltered from English-manufactured products. When the war was over, imports came in, and they began to be outcompeted. These urban artisans provided the urban mass base for the Constitution. Jack Maine's book on the Anti-Federalists is excellent, showing exactly who was for the Constitution and why, who was against it and why, and the blitzkrieg tactics that the pro-constitutional people used to put it through. I commend to your attention some of the speeches against the Constitution, such as Patrick Henry's in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. It was a bitter and magnificent attack on the Constitution, saying that if you adopt this, you will lose liberty, you will lose the republic, you will have power and empire. He was setting forth the power versus liberty and the empire versus republic theme. Jefferson was a bit of a trimmer on the Constitution, as he would continue to be from then on. This is an important point of historical analysis. Historians of thought tend to deal with the big shots, like Jefferson versus Hamilton. Usually, the second-ranked people are purer than the top people, because the top people are usually selling out. To understand the Jeffersonian movement, dealing only with Jefferson distorts the thing. The Jeffersonians themselves, the second-ranked people, especially Macon, Randolph, and Taylor, are much purer and more Jeffersonian than Jefferson, who was constantly compromising and selling out. The Anti-Federalists then tried to push through a second constitutional convention. Their program was, this constitutional convention is a phony, a coup d'etat. Let's scrap it and have a second one, which would simply fix up the Articles of Confederation. The threat of a second constitutional convention was very real to the nationalists, so Madison, a wily opportunist, decided, okay, we'll give them their damn Bill of Rights, something he hated to do. That was essentially the deal which then defined American history. The Anti-Federalists got their Bill of Rights, which is a libertarian document, and the Nationalists got the text of the Constitution, which is an anti-libertarian document. If you read the text of the Constitution, and then the first 10 amendments, they read as if they were written by two different sets of people, which they were. The text says, Congress shall have the power to, and the Bill of Rights says, Congress may not do such and such. This sets up the tension in American history from then on between the Nationalists on one hand and the Libertarians on the other. Essentially, the Anti-Federalists gave up, which I think was a strategic mistake, by adopting the Constitution and then trying to limit it with strict construction. The Federalists put through their nationalist program, and the Jeffersonians attacked it. Jefferson himself was great as long as he was out of power. As soon as he got into power, he began to adopt the temptations of power. The War of 1812 is very important. It essentially brought in the protective tariff, the strong army and navy, the central bank, and public works. All of these were put in by the Jeffersonians themselves. They adopted virtually the entire Federalist program. The Federalists themselves died out because of their opposition to the war. So, at the end of the War of 1812, we have a very peculiar and dangerous one-party system in America, with the Federalists essentially having won, even though they themselves had disappeared. At this point, another very charming situation evolved. Jefferson himself, an aging figure at Monticello, was getting pretty bitter. He looked at what was happening and felt that the spirit of 76 and 98 had been dissipated, and that we had adopted federalism in the guise of republicanism. He did not think he blamed himself for this, but he certainly did not like the result. He started complaining about this to the people who visited him. It became a tradition for young, aspiring politicians to visit him for weekends and imbibe the spirit of the revolution. Two conversions of extreme importance took place. People visited on different weekends at Monticello. One was a young Martin Van Buren, and the other was Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri. Both of them came away with a real conversion experience, saying, "My God, we have to take back America from the Federalists. We've lost the spirit of the revolution." Van Buren in particular, a heroic figure in American history, started using all of his considerable political wiles to create a new party to take back America. He made an alliance with the old Jeffersonians, with Benton in Missouri, and then found a charismatic leader in Andrew Jackson. This essentially launched the Jacksonian era. The Jacksonian era is another point which is difficult for non-libertarians to understand. Historians have been arguing for a long time about what the Jacksonians were. Were they hard money people, agrarian radicals, rising entrepreneurs? They were essentially all of this because they were libertarians. They favored entrepreneurship as long as it was not connected with the state. They were against special privilege and monopoly privilege in government. They favored the free market and read the classical economists very closely. They were believers in laissez-faire and hard money, the separation of money and banking from the state. These are not contradictory notions. I now want to bring in the Kleppner thesis and the new political history, which has come out in the last 9 years or so, to understand the mass base of political parties in the United States. One of the things that always puzzled me as an economist looking at 19th century history was, how come so many Americans were passionately interested in economic issues like the tariff, banking, gold, and silver? I cannot get my own students interested in that, and they are a captive audience. Yet you have a mass of the public really interested in this stuff, with a burning interest. How did this happen? It seems to me only the Klettner thesis provides a solution to this puzzle. Essentially, the Klettner thesis, in great oversimplification, is this. It is not that people started with a deep interest in banking. They started with gut-level interests in their local religious questions. They got most of their values from their ethnic religious composition. So, throughout the entire 19th century, from the 1820s on, you have two fundamental religio-political groups in the United States. You have what Klettner calls the Pietists and the Liturgicals. The Pietist framework means something like this. Each person is responsible for his own salvation, and to achieve it, he also has to achieve the salvation of other people. To do that, society has to minimize the conditions of temptation. Since everybody is responsible for his brothers' and sisters' salvation, they should use the state to outlaw conditions of temptation, specifically demon rum. The attack on alcohol is chronic and constant. Secondly, there was an attempt to crush anything on Sunday that was not going to church and praying. Third, if you cannot save the heathen immigrants coming in from abroad, you get their kids. So, it was important to crush the parochial schools and get the kids into the public school system so they could become good pietist Protestants. On the other side were the liturgicals, basically Catholics and also high Lutherans. Their position was that salvation comes from the church through obeying the liturgy or the creed. The church is responsible for personal salvation. There is no responsibility for society to go out and save all these people against their will, or for the state to outlaw things. Essentially, the Catholics and Lutherans believed in a personal laissez-faire approach. On liquor, they enjoyed drinking it in moderation. The German Lutherans and Catholics had a great tradition of drinking beer on Sundays in beer gardens, so outlawing liquor and outlawing it on Sundays was a real pain in the neck for them. So we have a situation that Klettner rightly called imperialism for 80 to 100 years, constant attempts by pietists to outlaw liquor, enforce Sunday blue laws, and outlaw parochial schools. The way this got transmitted to national economic issues was this. The leadership of both parties, and it is pretty clear the Whigs and then the Republicans were the Pietist Party and the Democrats were the Liturgical Party, transmitted a message to their rank and file. The Pietists said, look, we need big government at home to save everybody and eliminate sin. In the same way, we need big government on the national level to keep out cheap foreigners and the cheap products of their labor. The Whig Republican economic program was translated from the consciousness of the people on a religious, local level. In the same way, the Democratic leadership told their people, look, the same SOB wasps who are trying to take away your liquor, your parochial schools, and your Sunday enjoyment. These same people are also using big government and paternalism on the national level to take away your cheap imports and to destroy the value of your savings through inflation and bank credit expansion. So the passion of the people originally came from their local religious issues and was then expanded by political leadership to national economic questions. After the Civil War, this structure became even clearer. The Libertarian, laissez-faire Democrats versus the statist, pietist Republicans. What changed this? As Klettner points out, by the 1890s, the Democrats were winning out. For one thing, the liturgicals had more babies than the pietists, so just by demographics, there was an increase in democratic strength. What then happened was the Panic of 1893, which politically destroyed the Cleveland leadership, the laissez-faire part of the Democratic Party. This left a power vacuum within the party, to be filled by the evil Bryan. Bryan concentrated in his very person the antithesis of everything libertarian and the essence of everything pietist. Historians tend to think of the good Bryan, the representative of the people against the interest who favored free silver, and the bad Bryan, who favored outlawing everything, including liquor and the teaching of evolution. It is the same pietist Bryan. He always had the same views. Bryan was able to take over the Democratic Party in the fateful convention of 1896 through a Southwest alliance. The South was always the anomaly, being all pietist, so there was a pietist faction within the Democratic Party. Then you had the mountain states. With this pietist alliance of the South and Mountain States, Bryan was able to take over the party. Can you imagine the anguish of the liturgicals who found their party taken away from them? It was a real trauma. What were they going to do? Some of them dropped out, and from 1896 on, there was a steady decline in voting rates. Others shifted to the Republican Party, which was also experiencing an interesting change. The Mark Hanna McKinley forces changed the Republican Party during the 1890s to make it much more moderate and centrist. They kicked out the prohibitionists and became sort of a blah party, like the current parties. They also gave up on the silver question and decided to adopt the gold standard in 1896. So we then have the Democrats collapsing as the laissez-faire party, and this means the institutionalization of laissez-faire becomes obsolete. This leaves a power vacuum which enables the progressive period to come in. It enables the technocrats to take over, because the political parties no longer become very important. People do not care about them anymore. As the two parties become indistinguishable in the way we know and love today, the political parties become less and less important. This brings in the Kolko-Weinstein analysis, where the progressive period is able to take over with technocracy and statism through administrative agencies, with Congress and the political parties becoming much less important. The reason I prefer Kolko to other historians is this. Kolko shows, empirically, that the American economy was not becoming more monopolistic in the late 19th century. On the contrary, various business interests, especially headed by the Morgans, were trying to achieve monopoly and could not do it in the free market. Even with the protective tariff put in by the Republicans, they could not do it. They tried through cartels and mergers to have one firm in each industry, and in each case, it flopped. It is a beautiful testament to the free market how these things flopped. Morgan was a big railroad investor, and he constantly tried to organize railroad cartels in the 1860s and 70s, and they kept flopping because of competition, secret price cutting, and new railroads coming in. So then, the big railroad interests turned to the federal government to create the cartels for them, resulting in the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC. This is the hallmark of later progressive regulation. The big business forces who were seeking monopoly in the market and could not find it turned to the government to impose it. They were up against an ideological or PR problem. The United States was built on anti-monopoly. How then were these big business groups going to impose monopoly and cartel institutions? They got away with it by claiming that they were anti-monopolistic. They did it in the name of anti-monopoly. To do this, they had to have intellectuals spinning out their apologetics. The ICC was supposed to be put in to curb big railroad monopoly for the benefit of the people. This was the interpretation historians all gave to the progressive period until about 15 years ago. This is the old shuck. What really happened was that big business, trying to achieve monopoly in the free market and failing, turned to the government to impose it in the name of anti-monopoly. The first thing the ICC did when they came in was, first of all, outlaw secret price cutting, which is the way cartels are broken from within. Second of all, they imposed the high freight rates which the railroads were trying to get in the free market, which the Morgans tried and failed to achieve. So we see then that government regulation in general is a cartelizing device. In order to do this, as Weinstein points out, big business opinion, expressed through the National Civic Federation, led the way. Interestingly enough, the National Civic Federation people said they had two basic enemies: the socialists on their left and what they called the anarchists of the NAM, National Association of Manufacturers, on their right. The NAM would not have called themselves anarchists, but this was an expression of the old laissez-faire viewpoint. But you see, at that point, the laissez-faire people had no institutional expression. There was no party left for them. Laissez-faire intellectuals were literally dying out. The last great expression of laissez-faire intellectuals was the Anti-Imperialist League, formed in 1898 to oppose the Spanish-American War, particularly our War of Conquest in the Philippines. The Anti-Imperialist League was almost all elderly laissez-faire abolitionists in their 70s and 80s, headed by Edward Atkinson of Boston. They were extremely gutsy. Atkinson, for example, wrote a pamphlet to our soldiers in the Philippines urging them to mutiny. This pamphlet was confiscated by the post office. We then have a growing group of intellectuals, technocrats, PhDs, a new thing coming out of Germany, economists, social workers, sociologists, historians, and engineers, all part of a tremendous growth of professionalization and organization in America, all of whom wanted a piece of the pie. If you read some of these guys, like the head of the National Association of Civil Engineers, they said, "We are engineers. We have a complex economy, and therefore engineers should run the country." They were quite blatant about it. One of the fascinating things about the progressive period is the forthrightness of these people. Physicians became organized medicine. It is endless. I am trying to write a book on the progressive period, and the book keeps receding into the future as I find new horrors. The physicians, the psychiatrists, everybody was in there trying to grab power and wealth, to monopolize their profession, to keep out interlopers, to raise their income, and then to achieve political power. What you essentially have is a professionalization of the pietist impulse. It became less fashionable to talk about outlawing sin in the name of religion. It became more fashionable to outlaw things in the name of science, health, and hygiene. But it was essentially the same people doing the same things. The paradigmatic case is that these doctors and psychiatrists were born as pietists, then went to college, dropped their faith, and became do-gooders and power-lusters. It is a secularization of the old pietist impulse. Through history, the state is always run by a minority ruling class. How are they going to get the public to go along with this? The taxes, the wars, the conscription. How do they get them to obey? Kings found from early on that the way to get the public to swallow their power is to align themselves with the intellectuals. This is the great concept of the court intellectual. Before the 18th century, these were almost always priests and ministers. The alliance of church and state was important because the church told the people, you have to obey the state is divine. In return, the state collected taxes to support the church. It was a very cozy situation. What we have coming in with the progressive period was a new form of the state-church alliance, a new marriage of throne and altar. Except now, the throne was not the king, but the president, Congress, and the bureaucrats. And the church now included not just ministers. The social gospel movement was doing the same thing, but mostly secularized intellectuals, engineers, physicians, economists, and so on, all looking for power and all using the common good as the excuse. Interestingly, it is no coincidence that the progressives were extremely racist. They believed in compulsory racism through the government. Imperialist foreign policy also comes in with the progressives. When the Progressive Party was founded in 1912, a New York Times reporter said Teddy Roosevelt's convention seemed like a religious camp revival meeting. They were singing hymns all the time, breaking into speeches with hymns, and shouting, "Amen." Teddy Roosevelt, in his own person, almost embodied the whole progressive spirit in every aspect. I think I have succeeded in illuminating at least a new paradigm in American history, weaving Balin, Maine, Kleppner, and Kolko into this picture. If you would like, I can carry it briefly into the 20th century. Interestingly enough, when I gave a similar address at the University of Oregon, the graduate students were pretty unsympathetic to all of this stuff until I got to the current period. They were much more willing to take a so-called conspiracy analysis about Carter, for example, than they were about Teddy Roosevelt. The Democratic Party from the 1870s on into the 20s and 30s was essentially a Morgan-dominated party. This was not necessarily bad from a libertarian point of view, because they were originally fairly libertarian in their outlook, but they started shifting by the late 19th century. I think it is no accident, for example, that the national chairman of the Progressive Party was George W. Perkins, a Morgan partner. You find Morgan partners everywhere in strategically located positions. On the other hand, you had the Republican Party, which was essentially dominated by the Rockefeller family from 1870 on. If you look at the Republican presidential candidates, at least half of them in this period were from Ohio: Hayes, Garfield, McKinley, Taft, Harding. Why Ohio? The hypothesis here is that Ohio was dominant in the Republican Party because Ohio was essentially the Rockefeller Party. Rockefeller's base was in Cleveland, and he essentially dominated the Republican Party of Ohio. He was also a pietist. Mark Hanna, the head of the Republican Party of Ohio, was an industrialist in business with Rockefeller, as well as being a friend of his from high school. In 1900, the Rockefellers were essentially dominant because the Republican Party was dominant. Shortly after the McKinley election, a lone nut appears, and McKinley is bumped off, fortuitously bringing to power Morgan's man, Teddy Roosevelt. One of the first things Roosevelt does is start using an instrument which had been totally dead up to that point, the Sherman Antitrust Act. Suddenly, Roosevelt takes this rusted weapon out of his arsenal and starts using it with a vengeance. Against whom? He used it against Standard Oil. He said he was not against all trusts, only the bad trusts. The bad trusts somehow all happened to be Rockefeller companies, and the good trusts were U.S. Steel and International Harvester, which were Morgan companies. Roosevelt is succeeded by Taft, a regular Republican and therefore an ally of the Rockefellers. Taft is even more antitrust oriented, but he uses the antitrust weapons fairly, particularly against whom? Against U.S. Steel and International Harvester, in other words, against the Morgan companies. It seems easy to interpret the Taft administration as essentially Rockefeller's revenge on the Morgans. The Morgans got really hopped up. They are not used to this kind of treatment, so they launched the Progressive Party purely, it seems, to smash Taft and make sure he was not reelected, with Teddy Roosevelt as the presidential candidate. We come now to World War I, which, as Weinstein says, was the culmination of the progressive impulse. You cannot imagine how they loved World War I. By they, I mean big business, big unions now coming in, fostered by government, and intellectuals running the economy and the society. Boy, did they love it. Economists finally reached their apogee, planning the economy. Historians were out there telling lies about Germany. And big business finally found that monopoly really works. They cartelized every part of the economy. The War Industries Board, for example, had a steel section headed by steel industrialists, who would then be negotiating with other steel industry members, usually from the same firms. They came to very cozy conclusions, fixing prices and production, and they wanted to continue this after the war. All the politicians who came to the fore then were very young and stayed to plague us for about 50 years. Bernard Baruch, Franklin Roosevelt, Herbert Hoover. All these people originated in World War I, basically. They were mostly all friends and thought alike. Their idea was to bring back to American society the joy we had in World War I, the same sort of institutions, the same sort of collectivized society. And they basically succeeded in doing this. When the New Deal comes in, first in the Hoover administration and then the Roosevelt administration, the same institutions get resurrected. The War Finance Corporation, headed by Eugene Meyer, is resurrected as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation under Hoover, with the same Eugene Meyer heading it, using the same offices in Washington. There was an attempt by most of these guys to continue the collectivized war effort as a permanent part of the peace structure. It was beaten largely because of Newton Baker, the Secretary of War, who was a semi-laissez-faire type who thought it was going too far. But ever since then, people like Hoover, Baruch, and Roosevelt looked back to World War I as a great paradigm. Rexford Tugwell, a famous Roosevelt brain truster, wrote during the 1920s that if only the war could have continued a couple more years, we could have had full socialism in the United States. That sort of brings me up to date. Thank you very much.
Next, the audience asks Professor Rothbard some questions. First question. Does this tie in with recent research that attempts to link Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, particularly the Rockefellers, with the more Marxist-oriented socialism?
I do not think so. I think that is pretty bizarre. For one thing, while it is true that various Wall Street bankers loan money to the Bolsheviks, on the other hand, they loan money to everybody. It is their business to lend money, so the fact that you lend money to somebody does not necessarily mean you are tied in with them politically. Most of the evidence for this is very flimsy. One of the things that gives conspiracy analysis a bad name is that it is used with a meat cleaver instead of a scalpel. The tendency is to lump all the bad guys together in one big group. It does not work that way. What is really happening is there are a whole bunch of competing power sources and people wanting to achieve power. They are sometimes in coalition, sometimes competing. The idea that one group, or 12 guys somewhere, is pushing all the buttons is really pretty weird.
Second question. Do you have any comments on what is going down in Iran?
I do not have any particular words of wisdom. I just do not want to see a war launched. The thing that really worries me is the general attitude of the American public. I see it among college students, nuke them, and obscene attacks on Iranians per se. The moves to deport students and all that sort of thing, that is a very ugly situation. Most wars are incited by the public. I do not think this is a cause for nuking anybody. Even a friend of mine, one of the theoreticians of non-interventionism, is in favor of war here on the legalistic grounds that the embassy is American soil, so it was an attack on America. That is a very legalistic way of looking at it. It seems to me the best way to release the hostages is through quiet and calm, which is sort of what Carter was doing, not too badly. I am afraid of what he will be pushed into by the public. Bombing is not going to release the hostages, obviously. Another problem is looking at war as if it is some kind of police action. The American public says, they're evil, they've done criminal things, therefore they should be punished, as if you are dealing with people down the block. Even when people seize a building, you do not punish them if innocent people will be killed at the same time. You do not take a machine gun and spray a street to get a criminal if other people are walking there. It is very important from a libertarian viewpoint or any other viewpoint not to kill innocent people when you are doing your so-called punishment. In an international situation, when you are punishing Iranians or anybody else, you will always be killing innocent people, and lots of them. That is one of the basic reasons libertarians tend to be very non-interventionist.
Third question. On your point about the Bill of Rights being part of a deal after the nationalist coup d'etat of the Constitution, I find that interesting. Is there any case for giving Madison the benefit of the doubt? Or was he giving the game away when he wrote in his paper about why we did not need a Bill of Rights? He said that if we say, for instance, that the freedom of the press shall not be abridged, someday someone will argue with a semblance of reason that the government was supposed to decide what freedom of the press is and whether it is abridged or not.
Oh yeah, he was giving the game away. The thing is, the Anti-Federalists were not just in favor of a Bill of Rights. They were against any kind of monopoly of the Supreme Court. The concept of a monopoly of the Supreme Court doing the ultimate interpretation really comes in with Marshall, a lame duck Supreme Court justice who rewrites the whole Constitution. There is nothing in the Constitution that says the Supreme Court is the ultimate power to decide anything. Calhoun pointed out in a marvelous little book called A Disquisition on Government that if you have a Constitution and then you have a monopoly government institution with the power to interpret the Constitution, you have had it. Because what is going to happen is, inevitably, the guys in power, and the Supreme Court is part of the government, are going to expand the power of government. The guys out of power will call for strict construction, but they are going to lose. Eventually, you are going to have a general trend toward total despotism. I think he is right.
Fourth question. Would you agree that the separation of powers and constitutional checks and balances, which the Federalists enjoyed so much, was more or less an illusion?
The checks and balances and separation of powers, that was the Montesquieu shuck. The conservatives, by which I mean statists, in the 18th century were looking to Montesquieu as their model rather than Locke or Cato's letters. The idea that you have the executive, judicial, and legislative arms all checking and balancing each other, to a very minor extent they do, but usually it is really a scam because it is all the government. A real check and balance would be, say, the Principles of 1798, where New York could nullify a federal law which was oppressive to New York. That would be a check and balance. But the other stuff is really phony.
Fifth question. You mentioned that after Bryan, after the rise of progressivism, the laissez-faire radical individualist tradition became paralyzed. What prevented an aggressive counterattack, a regrouping into a new party, a new Martin Van Buren, Andrew Jackson movement in the 20th century?
That is probably it. I do not know. The trend was against them. They were dying out. Do not forget, when Van Buren did it, it was done when most of the American public really believed in that ideology. By the early 1900s, it seemed to be the other way. Maybe they could have pulled it off, but nobody strong thought of it.
Sixth question. This goes back to the very beginning of your speech, where you talked about libertarianism being a purely political philosophy. You mentioned liberty versus power means social power versus state power. The fact that you brought up religion as such a strong leader and director of politics in the 19th century, it seems to me that there was a strong cultural stream that was directing political thought, and that there seemed to be a stronger relationship between libertarianism or non-libertarianism from a cultural point of view, and not just a political point of view.
There is no question about the fact that culture influences politics. I am not denying that at all. It is just that libertarianism per se is a political philosophy. There are all sorts of influences on that, no question about it. There are all sorts of social philosophies that people can have that can make them more libertarian. It is just that the actual technical doctrine, so to speak, is purely political. So you can have all sorts of different moral views, or no views at all, or religious views, and still be libertarian or not be libertarian. It is true that sociologically, there might be specific cultural aspects that tend to make people more libertarian. What they are, I do not really know. I know about the 19th century, and it is something to really investigate.
Last question. In the last 30 years, I have seen the rise of a peculiar, disjointed confluence of sympathies, with so-called liberals or progressives supporting a considerable range of civil liberties, while being fanatically antagonistic to freedom of action in the economic area. And advocates of greater freedom in the economy are similarly fanatical and puritanical in the civil liberties area. Do you have any idea how this developed?
I am not sure. Historically, that is a piece of what happened. You can take a view, such as the Southern Pietists tended to take, that each individual is responsible for his own salvation, period, not for other people's. That tended to make you more individualistic. This is what Kleppner has in his new book, which I have not had a chance to read completely yet. But it is interesting, as I say, the liturgicals were laissez-faire in economics and in personal values until 1900 or so. Liturgicals now still tend to be a little bit more civil liberties oriented, and Pietists a little bit more free market. But I do not know how that arose. That is a good question. Kleppner himself, his next book is going to deal with the post-1900 period, so he might reveal some stuff on that. It is a very good question.
Brother Bill in the White House, he's doing his best. He lay in the graveyard, he's taking his rest.